last but not least, we have a wonderful guest and activist who is a consultant to film industry and member of European Women's Audiovisual Network, EWA. Please welcome Tamara Tatishvili. Hello. Hi, great to have you here.
Thank you very much for having us here. We're delighted to this continuous cooperation with Pro Quota Film.
Thank you. So let's talk about activism. We started a little bit early with Daphne some minutes ago, but let's talk about activism. What supports the visibility for women in film?
I think I've listened to all the great speakers that you had, and somehow I feel like we need to put a very complex puzzle together. And this really responds to the kind of field we are collectively in, working for achieving a change in gender equality. And how are we actually doing it? And that's also very close to the heart of European Women Audiovisual Network that I represent. It is probably largely in recent years through activism. And that is not a general clause. It's a policy or action of thorough campaigning that brings political or a social change. And that, unfortunately, is not a cake that we're going to bake overnight and not even in 1 week. But this is this complex process of promoting, for advocating, and sometimes being very persistent for the change that brings better values to the society. And campaigning for that, I think, is something that made this agenda visible and more vivid. We have to give a credit to what has been achieved. Organizations like yours, like many others that you have invited as guests, really contributed vastly to the visibility of the malfunction of the equality in our screen industry, I would say. But that, of course, does not mean that we have achieved the target, but we are at least there, out and loud, I believe, to try to understand that enough has been collected, I would say, to think that now it is time for a practical action.
And what could that practical action be? Should it be more force or more pressure to politics, for example, or to politicians?
I think this, of course, also differs from one country to another. But my personal viewpoint is that the change happens horizontally and vertically. And the real change can stay if you have an access to the power and the decision making. And that means that we have to, of course, understand what does it mean when we talk about the elements that make the agenda of gender equality. So let's maybe try to shortly get practical about it. So that is access to funding and equal pay. So it means that there can be a lot of practical action in place by relevant institutions that work on the inequality that exists. It is about combating stereotypes, representation, and the role models, which is another set of action that has to be taken, and the systemic gender discrimination, which has been there for very long, as we all know, and the two previous speakers of yours did mention some examples around it. I think that we need to challenge policymakers. Yes, that's the role of the activists and organizations, but also individuals who are vocal about it. And somehow, let's say movements like 50-50 by 2020, Me Too, practical actions that other organizations offer, like mentorship schemes for female producers or tailor-made script writing for combating stereotypes on paper. These are the practicalities that need to be achieved, and they will not be achieved if the policymakers are not ready to understand that the data is there. And then, of course, not look for the ready-made cut for all territories. That would be too naive to think about, but really take important national decisions to achieve a better result. And if in a voluntary manner you cannot do it, then you have to make it an obligation. This is what we think should happen.
Mm-hmm. Of course, we all know that art is not about money, but we still see that money is connected to art, for example, in funding films. And we all know, we heard that today also, that female films are funded with less money. So how can you connect these things, money and strategy or activism?
I connect it to the complexity of the subject and complexity of the systemic discrimination that happens. Because we also believe, I think we do know that there have been countries, and I sadly there are still some who believe that the gender topic and the representation of women is an issue of women only. It's like a little Cinderella field that couple of women are concerned, and it's not a societal issue. And I think that's where the whole problem starts, and then you can relate it to the money issue as well. If you have an access to power, if you have right people, aware people deciding, men or women, deciding about the content they are financing, about the characters they are putting on screen, then this change is escalating in a more efficient pace, like Susan and Daphne were also indicating towards. And that means that you cannot anymore discuss gender equality as a little topic. And you can also not allow that other important values and issues are kind of overshadowing it a little bit. Man, in a subsidy-driven business or sector like we are all in, I think the politicians and the policymakers should absolutely feel a bit more responsible on allocating the funds. And this is how you go to the core of the problem. And that's how you eliminate or you try to eliminate the stereotype on the script level. This is how you count the crew. You incentivize the producers to employ not necessarily only men in traditionally men-driven positions, but you recruit female as well. But what is more important for me in all that is that you don't necessarily only do it for a specific woman or a specific profession representative. I think what is very important, you do it for a better societal development. And that is the core, because that is how you bring the informed and the progressive change. And it has to be about action and not about declaration only.
What do you think about the idea of, for example, force a film festival to include 50% of, I don't know, female produced, directed films or something like that, to just make the rule?
Right. Absolutely. All the questions you're driving is kind of logically taking us on a trip of of the film value chain somehow. And we cannot only rely on the funder. And if we have some good examples, and luckily we do have good examples of countries where policymakers, where funders are more aware than in others, of course, then if you create the content, then this content has to have an equal circulation. And that is when the whole topic of alternative curation, progressive programming, looking out for content that is daring, that is unapologetic sometimes, really bringing this to the audience and not expecting that a film has to have like a unified acceptance, but really starting a debate that is harsh. We know that these debates are harsh because those debates bring us back to the historically rooted stereotypes in many ways. And I think that if all festivals really sign up to the pledge, for instance, that we know has been existed, if not COVID-19, 2020 should have been a rather important year for this agenda. We should have all sit together and really make a very critical self-check. I think right now we are a little bit in a situation when the bigger enemy, like the invisible enemy out there for the health, is overshadowing the issues. But that does not mean that there is no home domestic violence. That does not mean that female are not getting access to the budgets that are higher. It means that all our problems are still there. Let's give a credit to the action that we collectively did, that we have achieved a good awareness, but we are certainly very much still far away from the targets being met.
So can you tell us something about what helped, for example, Georgian women in this to get a foot into the door or to get around in the business? Is there any kind of special training or something?
Thank you very much for relating to my homeland. I work internationally for over 10 years now, but my heart is always, of course, in the country from where I'm coming and where I started to discover the cinema and then make it more international. I shall be very brief in my reply. In Georgia, there's been a huge movement of young talent female filmmakers who, in my view, in my personal opinion, are absolutely rewriting the history of a contemporary woman and asking a very critical questions about the past as well. But the only drive they have is the will and the resistance, and the real drive to go out there, not necessarily always wait for the right moment, but just unapologetically go out and make the stories they want to be seen. We have a very current example of that, a film titled Beginning, made by Dea, which was labeled as a Cannes Film 2020, scooped 4 main awards in San Sebastian a week ago, and in a way even made a very peculiar case of a top European festival giving 4 main awards to one film. And the jury comment there was that the film has achieved to show us a new narrative in cinema, and to show us with a female director, female leads, and a project that was in severe finding conditions for many years before it hit the screen. So I think for the moment, there are some initiatives in Georgia, but not necessarily structured programs that help. But because of the geopolitical and the historic context of small country like Georgia, it's also a social behavior that local women, local artists are finding a strong moment to unite and come up with the cinematic language.
So that leads me to my next question, because that sounds like networking, of course, is very important in Georgia and in every country. But can you tell us some more things about networking and collaborations? Why is it so important on a local and on a European and international level?
We believe that networks give insight into important issues, and I think we all collectively, and when I say we, it's you, your organization, it's us, it's many other partners that we team up in time by time, that bring the importance of this subject to funders, to festivals, maybe cross-sectoral as well. And what we also create is an avenue for a long-term relation. And at this point, I would like to thank Pro Quota Film that they are, for instance, always reaching out to EWA network. And for us, it's a gesture of real practical cooperation. What lacks a little bit is to translate the existing data into policy. Not everywhere, but it's still not on the level that we would all collectively like to do. And the collective action that we are taking as networks, as collaborators, brings us to an important element to once again make a vivid signal that equality is actually a fundamental element of human rights. It is a topic, if overseen, then we absolutely are fading away from democracy. And if we are fading away from democracy, then the value and the quality of life of our citizens, not in a country, but globally, I would say, is decreasing. And for that reason, equality agenda cannot be something that is overshadowed, but rather has to be proactively put into action. And that can be done through programs on European level, through national policies, and real and not only declarative cooperations between professional networks.